Hey everyone, today I'm back in Lost Ark to talk about the newest class that released a couple of weeks ago into our Western version of the game, Aeromancer. This is a class that I had been looking forward to coming out on our servers for quite some time now, like basically ever since she was released in Korea. She looked like an incredibly fun class to play that would fit my playstyle pretty much perfectly. And so I wanted to kind of give it some time, play around with her a little bit. I got her to Akan pretty quickly, basically as soon as I was able to at the beginning of the third week. And I've been playing around with her quite a bit to just get a better feel for the class and kind of form my opinion on it before I wanted to make this video. Now, a couple of weeks have gone past and basically all of my first impressions of the class have still remained true to this day. She is hands down one of my favorite classes in the game. She's really fun to play. She's also a pretty solid class as well, both in the damage department and the supportive utility that she brings to the party. So I just kind of wanted to talk about the class today, both give my own thoughts on the class itself, go over what she brings to the party, and also the different play styles that are available for her if you are interested in trying her out yourself. So when it comes down to Aeromancer, what does she bring? Because she's kind of looked at as this more utility-based DPS character, kind of like a first intention war dancer, because she has more than just one synergy for the party. Her main synergy is a 10% crit rate buff that is applied at all times. Well, technically it's a 10% crit resistance debuff on the boss, but basically same thing. She gives your party 10% crit rate, which has a 100% uptime, kind of like Gunslinger, Deadeye, or Arcanist. And 10% crit rate is something that most classes in the game really like to have. Now, on top of that, she has a second synergy which has to do with her identity gauge. The identity gauge itself is very simple. You fill up the bar, once it's full you can use it to cast a skill called Sun Shower, which is like a little circle around you, and all of the enemies inside of the circle take damage over time, and you also apply some buffs to either your party members or debuffs onto the enemies depending on the class engraving that you choose. When we're talking about the more like synergy related class engraving, most people look at Wind Fury because this is the one that buffs your party. This turns your Sun Shower identity skill into somewhat more of a second yearning effect, like you know the yearning circle from your supporter. That's basically what this circle will do. Of course, this does stack with yearning itself, but it functions a little bit differently. It only affects people that are actively inside of the circle, so as soon as they leave the circle, the effect is immediately gone. There's no lingering 15 seconds like it is with normal yearning, and it also still deals damage to the enemies, and it also applies to yourself, whereas the yearning circle of a support does not apply to the support itself. Now, when it comes down to Wind Fury, this is the swiftness-based build, so you might be thinking, well, a swiftness build doesn't build gauge as fast, and that would be true in most cases, but for Aeromancer, the Wind Fury engraving itself has a built-in gauge generation effect to it, where every time you use an umbrella skill, which is one of the two main skills that Aeromancer has access to, you are going to be getting a buff that lasts for 3 seconds. And if you use a second umbrella skill within those 3 seconds, you're going to be generating a bunch of identity gauge. And this buff will refresh itself every time that you use an umbrella skill. So if you're using multiple umbrella skills back to back, you're going to be building up your full identity gauge in a matter of seconds. So while the uptime on your Sun Shower buff might not be the same as the Drizzle Aeromancer, which I'll talk about in just a second, because the Wind Fury engraving also shortens the duration of Sun Shower, so you have to build up your identity gauge more often than you would when you're playing Drizzle, but you're still going to have a fairly high uptime on this effect. And the effect is also very powerful, because there are a lot of classes in the game that are a little bit more slow to play, that can really use some extra attack speed and movement speed, and pairing them together with a Wind Fury Aeromancer is just going to feel really nice. The other build then is the Drizzle build, and this basically does the opposite of what the Wind Fury one does. First of all, it'll make your circle bigger instead of smaller. It will also extend the duration of your Sun Shower effect instead of shorten it, but it will give a defensive aspect to the Sun Shower buff instead of an offensive one. Whereas Wind Fury provides attack speed, movement speed, Drizzle is going to be providing you with damage reduction instead. So maybe not as kind of like desired to have, especially for those slower classes, but it is going to make you a little bit more tanky, so you could maybe face tank and attack extra if you want to greet some extra uptime. And of course, when it comes down to progression rating, you're not going to be feeling the damage of the normal patterns as much, because when you're going into a new fight, you're bound to get hit by some normal patterns, and having a Drizzle Aeromancer in the team is going to lessen the damage that you take a little bit. So that's when it comes down to the synergies. She will always have the 10% crit rate buff, or crit resistance debuff, that is going to be applied 100% of the time, and this applies to both of the builds. And then for Wind Fury, she's going to be providing attack speed and movement speed for around 10 seconds with a 10-second cooldown, something along those lines. And then when it comes to Drizzle, she will be providing a defensive buff instead that will provide you some damage resistance. Now, when it comes down to the two playstyles then, they are basically two very different playstyles. With Wind Fury, she is a very spammy class, usually going full swiftness and building around mostly umbrella skills to play into the Wind Fury buff that you get every time that you use an umbrella skill, so that you can get your identity gauge back as soon as possible, because not only does it provide the attack speed and movement speed, but having the circle active still deals damage to enemies, and the damage that it does is actually pretty reasonable as well. You can even use a damage gem onto this effect if you want to do so, which I actually do. So yeah, going full into the umbrella skills when playing with Wind Fury is basically what you're going to be doing. Drizzle, on the other hand, is going to be playing completely around the weather skills instead, which are more ranged skills. They're still a little bit close range sometimes as well. A few of them require you to be pretty much into melee range, but you have a little bit more range to play with, kind of like a mid-range caster, I guess you could say, and you're going to be playing around your identity gauge a whole lot more, because the Drizzle engraving is going to make it so that your weather skills deal bonus damage while Sun Shower is active, which is also why Drizzle extends the duration of your Sun Shower skill. The way how you basically play Drizzle is kind of like a mini Igniter Sorceress. You use two skills to build up gauge. Once your gauge is full, you activate it, you use your big 3 spenders, or 4 depending on which of the builds that you're playing. And then right before your gauge ends, you can use those 3 big skills again, and then you just rinse and repeat with building your gauge all over again. Both playstyles are pretty fun. They offer something different, whereas Wind Fury is more of a piano class, always needing to be in melee range. Also working with the combo system of Wind Fury, because you're playing around the occurrence buff, which comes from 2 of your skills, which basically grants you a small shield, and then your 4 major DPS skills will consume the shield to deal bonus damage to the boss. So you're always pressing shield generating skill into major DPS skill. You're always alternating these 2 things, which is kind of like the rhythm that Wind Fury plays into. Whereas with Drizzle, you're playing a little bit more at range. You're also a bit slower because it is a full spec class. The reason why you want to go full spec is because specialization also directly affects the damage of your weather skills. So not only is it going to allow you to build your identity gauge faster, it is also going to be affecting the damage of your skills directly as well. So you do want to go full spec when you're playing Drizzle, and then you're basically just going to build up your gauge, activate it, use your 3 big spells, use some filler skills in between to wait for your 3 big spells to come back, use them again at the end of your gauge duration, and then just rinse and repeat from there. When it comes down to the builds, when it comes down to Wind Fury, there is basically 2 builds that you can choose from. 7 of the skills are going to be exactly the same between the 2 builds, which will be the 7 umbrella skills, but the weather skill that you'll be taking is something that you can choose based on preference, and there's basically 2 that you can choose from: Whirlpool and Tornado. The reason why most people nowadays prefer Whirlpool is because the cooldown lines up a lot nicer with your synergy skill, and your synergy skill plus the weather skill is usually what you will be using to proc Conviction Judgment, because Wind Fury Aeromancer can run into some severe mana issues if you're not using Focus Runes and Conviction Judgment, so you do really want to have that combo in there. Whirlpool also provides +1 weak point, which in some of the Guardian raids that we have nowadays, Kaliligos, Hanumatan, and now also Sonavel, they all have weak point checks, so having that extra weak point in there can be quite nice as well. Tornado, on the other hand, is a ranged skill as opposed to the melee skill that Whirlpool is, so you can use that range to keep some extra uptime, and it also does a lot more stagger, so when you're doing fights that require a bit more stagger, you could switch to that one if you wanted to do so, but the cooldown and also the mana cost of the Tornado skill is much higher than that of Whirlpool, so it can kind of contribute to the existing mana issues that you can run into with Wind Fury, and it's also not as nice to proc Conviction Judgment because the cooldown kind of misaligns with your synergy skill if you are using it on cooldown. When it comes down to Drizzle, there are also basically two main ways to play it, with 6 weather skills and 2 umbrella skills, with the 2 umbrella skills kind of being your synergy skills. One is your synergy, the other is your counter, which can also run the synergy as your tripod if you want to do that. But there's also one where you run 3 umbrella skills instead. And the main reason why you would want to do that is because of weak point. Drizzle is a build that only has 1 level of weak point in its entire kit, which is on the Whirlpool skill. Outside of that, there's no weak point to be had, whereas the Windfury Aeromancer already has 3 weak points in her base kit, getting another 4th weak point if you do run that Whirlpool skill. Drizzle doesn't have any of that, so the purpose of the 5-3 build, 5 weather, 3 umbrella skills, is to bring the level 2 weak point Windfury skill into the Drizzle build, and that's kind of like the whole thing there. It is a little bit more clunky to play around in my opinion. The cooldown is also quite long because the whole thing with Windfury is that you have low cooldowns because you go high into swiftness, but because Drizzle is a full spec build, that's not really the case. So I do prefer to play the 6-2 build and then kind of like try to play around the weak point with maybe carrying around a destruction bomb, but it is certainly an option if you want to have that extra weak point in your kit to run the Piercing Wind skill, I believe it is called, to get that extra 2 weak point into your build. When it comes down to me personally, Windfury is hands down my favorite of these 2 builds. I am a sucker for swiftness based classes. They're fast, they're snappy, they're spammy. It's just really fun to always be busy in this game. When it comes down to Drizzle, you are still busy most of the time because while you are going to be dealing with some longer cooldowns, you still actually have a lot of skills that you're going to be casting back to back, keeping up your synergy, using the filler skills during your burst window, that kind of stuff. You're basically always going to be casting something, even though you are going to be a little bit slower, but it does feel pretty nice. The burst window feels pretty good as well, and you're just going to be going back into that fun burst window pretty often as well. However, for me personally, if I had to make a choice, I would be playing Windfury more than Drizzle, which I'm also doing. However, I did decide to keep my Drizzle build around to do Chaos Dungeons, because Drizzle is amazing for Chaos Dungeons, which is where I am mainly going to be using it. I do still play Drizzle every now and then when I'm doing like a Guardian raid or even a normal raid, just to have some fun with it, because it is still a fun build to play around with, and burst classes usually tend to perform better in farm content as well, which Drizzle is a burst class, even though it's kind of more like a sustained burst class, I guess you could say. But for me personally, Windfury wins out because it is just the more fun build to play, and my teammates prefer having the Windfury one around as well, because it is going to be providing them with that attack speed and movement speed, which is going to feel a whole lot more impactful than just having some damage reduction, which we don't really care about as much. But Aeromancer, whether you're playing Windfury or Drizzle, is a pretty solid class. Her damage might not be amongst the S tier classes like Arcanist or Slayer, but her damage is still pretty good, and if you play well and the other people in your party might maybe be slacking a little bit, you can definitely take damage MVP. I've done it before, I'll probably do it more at some point as well. And it just feels really good to play because not only is your own personal damage solid, you also have decent stagger and good weak point, especially when you're playing Windfury. Your weak point is really good, and you're also providing some extra buffs to the party, like that attack speed, movement speed, or the damage reduction depending on which build you decide to play, which can feel quite good as well. For me personally, solid class to play, really fun, performed decently well, to the point where I don't really care too much that I'm like not always on the MVP screen, but still I know that I contributed enough damage to the party if I played well. And Aeromancer is also just a very easy class to play, so delivering that damage that you can get there is very easy to do so. So overall, Aeromancer is always just going to be a solid pick to have in your party, because you know the damage is most likely always going to be there, and she provides some really nice synergies. And I think that covers just about everything that I wanted to talk about with this class. I've been enjoying her a ton, gonna be playing her more in the future. She's already a mainstay in my main roster, don't think she's ever going to leave that. And yeah, that's kind of everything I wanted to say. So let me know what you think about Aeromancer. Have you tried one out? Has this video maybe been able to convince you to try one out if you haven't yet? Let me know down below. And with that, I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.